You'd think an old man fixing a birdhouse in his front yard wouldn't be a threat to anyone. But apparently, to Marlene Chadwick, our HOA's self-appointed queen of lawn tyranny, it was a crime punishable by a hefty fine and a nasty letter. It started last Tuesday. I had just pulled into my dad's driveway after work. He's 78, a retired firefighter with a bum knee and a love for birds. He was up on a step ladder, screwing in a tiny wooden birdhouse he'd painted himself. "Dad, you should have waited for me," I said, grabbing the base of the ladder. "Nonsense, Danny. I've been climbing ladders since before you were born." That's when I saw her. Marlene, mid-50s, platinum bob, sunglasses the size of teacups. She strutted across the street like she owned the zip code, clutching her HOA binder like it was the Constitution. "Mr. Zeller," she said, ignoring me completely. "That installation violates Section 7, subsection C of the HOA guidelines. No external structures allowed without prior written approval." My dad looked down at her like she'd grown a third eye. "It's a birdhouse. It's an unapproved fixture," she snapped. "You'll receive a fine by mail." I stepped in. "He's not putting up a satellite dish, Marlene. It's a 6-inch birdhouse." She turned to me slowly, mouth curling. "Daniel Zeller, you don't live here, you don't vote. You don't get a say." "Actually, I'm on the deed," I said, "and I know those guidelines. Section 7 applies to permanent structures, not decorative items." Her eyes twitched. "We'll see what the board says." She turned and walked back to her house like she'd won, but I knew better. I used to work in city code enforcement, and I'd seen people like her before, people who use rules as weapons, not guidance. That night, I pulled the HOA bylaws from the community website and printed every page. Then I drove over to Dad's and told him not to worry. But I also installed a motion sensor camera on the porch just in case. Good thing I did. Because what that camera caught the next morning, that's when things got interesting. The next morning, I got a motion alert on my phone at 6:43. I was brushing my teeth when I saw the preview thumbnail from the porch cam. Someone standing right at the edge of my dad's flower bed. I tapped the alert and rewound the footage. There she was again, Marlene, wearing a visor and workout leggings, holding a clipboard and some kind of measuring tape. She walked right onto the lawn like she had a deed to the soil. She paced in tight steps, measured the exact distance from the base of the birdhouse post to the sidewalk, and jotted something down. Then she bent over, pulled up one of my dad's marigolds, and tossed it aside like a weed. I drove over before the sun even finished rising. "Dad, did you see her out here?" I asked as I walked in. He looked up from his coffee. "Who?" "Marlene. She was on your lawn this morning, ripped up your flower." He set his mug down slowly. "That woman's got some nerve." I showed him the video. He just shook his head. "She thinks nobody's watching." Well, she's wrong about that. By noon, I had a strategy. I printed the footage, attached a time-stamped photo, and wrote a formal complaint to the city's Code Compliance Division. Trespassing and property damage, both violations. Not just HOA nonsense. Real offenses. But before I could even deliver the report in person, things escalated. Around 2:30, a white SUV with the HOA logo on the door pulled up. A guy in khakis and a polo shirt hopped out and walked up the driveway with a yellow envelope in hand. I met him halfway. "You Daniel Zeller?" he asked. "Yeah." "This is for your father," he said, handing over the envelope. "Notice of violation. He's got 72 hours to remove the unauthorized fixture or face escalating fines." "Who authorized this?" I asked. "This isn't even a board decision. The president signed off. That's all I know." I opened the envelope. The document was typed, but the signature at the bottom was unmistakable Marlene Chadwick. Underneath her signature, the words "Acting President" had been handwritten. She wasn't the president. The actual HOA president, a guy named Keith Langston, had recently had surgery and was recovering at his daughter's place in Arizona. But he hadn't resigned. I knew because I'd spoken to him personally last week, checking on a landscaping concern for my dad. So how was Marlene suddenly acting president? I made a few calls. First, to Keith's daughter, who confirmed he was still technically the HOA president even if he wasn't attending meetings. Then I called a neighbor, Mrs. Paloma, who'd been on the board for over a decade. She held an emergency vote, Paloma told me. Said Keith relinquished authority, we didn't see any proof. She just pushed through the motion and announced herself as acting president. She have a quorum, barely, 3 people, one of them's her cousin. That explained everything. Marlene had staged a quiet power grab while Keith was out of town recovering. With just enough allies or people too timid to oppose her, she seized control and started enforcing her own rules. I spent that evening digging through HOA meeting notes posted online. The last official record had no mention of a leadership change. No digital minutes, no scanned resignation, nothing legal. Which meant her authority was based on smoke and mirrors. I decided to put together a case, not just to defend my dad, but to expose her. The next morning, I filed a report with the city code office for trespassing, including the video footage and timestamp. I also filed a complaint at the county clerk's office alleging improper HOA procedure under the Davis-Sterling Act, the California law governing HOAs. But I didn't stop there. I reached out to 4 neighbors who had stories of Marlene's overreach. One had been fined for leaving a garden hose coiled the wrong way. Another was told her son's wheelchair ramp was aesthetic pollution. I gathered their statements, added them to a binder with printed bylaws, and highlighted every procedural violation Marlene had committed. Then I called a meeting. Not a sanctioned HOA meeting, just a neighborhood gathering. We held it in Mrs. Paloma's backyard. She still had the fold-out tables from her granddaughter's graduation, and I brought donuts and coffee to make it casual. Over 20 residents showed up. I stood near the back fence, holding my binder, and addressed them without a microphone. Some of you already know what happened to my dad, I began, but this isn't just about a birdhouse, it's about control. About someone abusing the rules we all agreed to live by. I handed out copies of the documentation I'd prepared, highlighted violations, screenshots of Marlene on people's lawns, and statements from affected neighbors. Then I showed the video. We propped up a laptop on a crate and played the footage of her trespassing. She ripped up his flower, someone muttered near the front. She did the same thing to my succulents last month, another added. That was the turning point. By the end of the evening, we had 10 signatures on a petition to call an emergency board meeting under Article 4, Section D of the bylaws. The petition triggered the right to force a vote of no confidence in any acting officer. We submitted the petition the next morning. The bylaws gave the board 72 hours to respond. Marlene tried to stall, claiming the signatures weren't valid, but the rules were on our side. The meeting was scheduled for Friday evening in the community rec center. When we arrived, the room was packed. Folding chairs formed uneven rows. People stood along the back wall. Marlene sat at the front with her cousin and one other board member. Her expression was tight, lips pressed together like she'd bitten a lemon. I brought my binder to the front table and placed it down with a soft thud. We're here to vote on the removal of Marlene Chadwick as acting president of the HOA, I said. On grounds of procedural misconduct, abuse of authority, and falsified leadership succession. You're not on the board, she said. No, I replied, but I am a voting homeowner. And the bylaws allow any member to bring evidence of board misconduct. The room stayed quiet as I handed out packets to the rest of the board, actual board members, not hand-picked cronies. I watched their eyes move across the pages. One of them, a soft-spoken man named Ira, raised his hand. I moved to remove Marlene Chadwick as acting president. The vote passed 6-1. She stood up abruptly, knocking her chair backward. This is harassment, she snapped. You're all being manipulated. No, Paloma said calmly. We're protecting our community. Security escorted Marlene out. Not because of the vote, but because she refused to leave after being removed. She knocked over a trash bin on her way out, muttering something about lawsuits. The next day, I got a call from the city. Mr. Zeller, Your trespassing complaint has been reviewed. We've issued a notice to Miss Chadwick. She'll need to appear in municipal court." I thanked them and hung up. My dad was on the porch sipping lemonade. "Looks like she finally got the message," he said. "And the birds still have their house," I added. He chuckled. Marlene's removal was immediate and final. Keith resumed his role once he returned, and the new board rewrote voting procedures to prevent future power grabs. Several residents volunteered to join the compliance committee, ensuring no more unchecked authority. The birdhouse stayed. So did the marigolds, replanted by a neighbor who brought over fresh soil as a peace offering. Justice didn't need flashing lights or sirens. Just a camera, a binder, and a community that finally stood up. 2 weeks after the vote that ousted Marlene, things had started to settle. Dad's front yard looked better than ever, thanks to a few neighbors who pitched in to replant the marigolds and repair a few patches of trampled grass. The birdhouse now had a pair of wrens nesting in it, and Dad seemed to spend most mornings watching them from the porch with a quiet sort of satisfaction. But just when we thought the drama had run its course, something new surfaced, something uglier. It started with a letter. Not one from the HOA, but from the county recorder's office. It was addressed to my dad and marked time sensitive. I opened it at the kitchen table while he was boiling water for tea. "Property lien notice," I read aloud, my voice tightening with every word. "Filed by Hillside Community Association for unpaid compliance penalties." Dad looked up, puzzled. "What penalties?" I scanned the form again. "They're claiming you owe over $9,000 in fines for code violations, multiple entries." All dated before Marlene was removed. He sat down slowly. "That can't be right. You cleared all that up." "I did," I said, flipping through the attached itemization. "And these don't even match the notices we received. These are completely different line items. And look at this, some of them predate the birdhouse." I pulled out my phone and called Keith. He answered after a couple of rings. "Keith, did the board authorize any new liens recently?" "No," he said immediately. "We're still auditing everything Marlene pushed through." "Why?" "She filed a lien on my dad's house. 9 grand. All tied to violations we never received notice for." There was a pause on the line. "I'd like to see a copy of that," Keith said. "Bring it to my place tonight." When I showed up at his house, Keith already had the HOA's financial logs open on his laptop. He took one look at the lien notice and frowned deeply. "These line items aren't in our ledger," he said. "These were never voted on, never recorded. Whoever filed this used an old form too. See the footer? We updated our letterhead last year, so she faked it. She must have submitted it before she was removed, but post-dated it to slip it past the system." I leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling. "She tried to bury my dad in debt on her way out." Keith nodded slowly. "We're going to need to bring this to the board, and the legal committee." "No," I said. "This is beyond committee. She forged legal documents and filed them with the county. That's criminal." That night, I drove straight to the sheriff's substation with the documents in hand. The deputy at the desk took one look at the forged lien and brought over a detective. By the following morning, a formal investigation was opened. The forged lien wasn't the only one. Turns out, there were 6 others, all targeted at residents who had either spoken out against Marlene or refused to comply with her more arbitrary rules. One woman, a widow in her 60s, had nearly remortgaged her home to pay off what she thought was legitimate debt. The detective assigned to the case, a no-nonsense woman named Sergeant Harwell, called me in for a follow-up interview. She used her access to HOA seal templates and filed these through a third-party notary who's now saying she forged their signature too, Harwell told me. "That's fraud, forgery, and abuse of authority. We're preparing to issue a warrant." By the end of the week, Marlene was arrested at her home in plain daylight. Several neighbors watched from their porches as 2 deputies escorted her to the back of a cruiser. Word spread quickly, and by evening, the community message board was flooded with messages of disbelief, relief, and more than a few questions about what else she might have done. I didn't post anything. I just made sure the lien on my dad's house was officially rescinded. But the fallout wasn't over yet. The county district attorney's office filed charges for falsifying public records and unlawful lien filing. During the discovery phase, they subpoenaed her emails from the HOA server. The IT firm managing the website handed everything over. That's when the real extent of her corruption came to light. Marlene hadn't just forged liens. She had also siphoned funds from the HOA's discretionary spending budget, small amounts at first, then larger ones. Spa appointments billed as community wellness events, a new patio set coded as common area renovation, and even a 3-night stay at a coastal resort listed under board strategy retreat. The total misuse exceeded $34,000. The board, stunned by the revelations, held a special session and voted unanimously to pursue civil litigation to recover the funds. Keith, despite his usual aversion to confrontation, agreed to testify if needed. Meanwhile, I volunteered to help overhaul the HOA's financial oversight protocols. We created a 3-person review committee, implemented mandatory dual signatures for any expenditure over $500, and required monthly public reports of all spending. Transparency became the new policy, not just a buzzword. At one meeting, an elderly man named Curtis stood up during the open session. "Never thought I'd say this," he said, "but I actually look forward to these meetings now. Feels like we're finally running things, not just being told what to do." The room applauded. Not out of politeness, but because it was true. As for Marlene, she took a plea deal. 2 years probation, full restitution, and a permanent ban from serving on any HOA or community board in the county. She sold her house quietly a few months later and moved out without fanfare. The empty property sat on the market for a while. No one was eager to move into a house with that kind of history. Eventually, a young couple bought it and gutted the place. New paint, new landscaping, even tore out the brick pathway Marlene had insisted everyone else match. Dad and I watched the renovation from the porch one afternoon. He sipped his tea, eyes on the workers hauling out old furniture. "Funny," he said. "All that fuss, and now it's like she was never even here." "Not quite," I replied. "She left a reminder." "Just not the one she meant to." He raised an eyebrow. "She reminded everyone how bad it can get when people stop paying attention, and how fast it can change when they finally do." He nodded, then pointed toward the birdhouse. "Think they'll let me build a second one?" I laughed. "You've got the board's full support." What started with a petty power trip ended in a complete restructuring of how the neighborhood governed itself. Not because people suddenly became perfect neighbors, but because they finally realized they had the power to say no to nonsense, to corruption, to bullies in nice clothes with clipboards. And with every bird that landed on Dad's birdhouse, it felt a little more like home again. 3 months after Marlene's arrest, the neighborhood was quieter. Not the uneasy quiet that used to follow her sidewalk patrols, but a calm that came from people finally feeling like they didn't have to watch their backs every time they trimmed a hedge. The board now held open Q and A sessions, and Keith made it a point to greet everyone at the start of each meeting. Change had taken root, and for the first time in years it was growing in the right direction, but something still didn't sit right with me. One afternoon, I stopped by the HOA office, the tiny brick building behind the tennis courts that doubled as the community maintenance depot. It had always been oddly well kept, considering our maintenance team was 2 part-timers and a shared landscaping contractor. A polished tile floor, a new copier, even a high-end espresso machine sat on the counter next to the fridge. Someone was living well in that little office. The records clerk, a woman named Tasha, had taken over the books after the previous treasurer resigned during Marlene's fallout. She looked up from her laptop when I came in. "Hey, Danny, need something?" "Just reviewing the maintenance budget. I'm helping Keith draft next quarter's spending plan," I said casually. She frowned. "That's strange. He didn't say anything about that." Yeah, it was last minute. Just wanted to double-check some numbers. She hesitated, then turned the screen toward me. I can pull the last 6 months, I nodded. Perfect. As she scrolled, I leaned in. Line items filled the screen. Most looked routine contractor payments, utility bills, repair costs. But one column caught my attention: equipment rentals. Can you open that? I asked. She clicked. A list expanded: generators, scaffolding, a tent structure, and a half-dozen industrial fans. The rental dates were all clustered around a 3-week period from earlier in the year. Why would we need fans and scaffolding? I asked. Tasha blinked. Those were for the drainage project on the north slope. I shook my head. That was handled by the city. They brought their own gear. I was there when the trucks showed up. Her lips pressed together. That's what Marlene told me. She said the HOA had to front the equipment cost and the city would reimburse us. Did they? She opened another window. No record of reimbursement. I reached into my bag and took out a flash drive. Mind if I copy that file? She hesitated. I'm not sure it's for Keith. I'll have him confirm in writing if needed. After a moment, she nodded and plugged the drive into her computer. I left with a copy of the expenditures, but I didn't go straight to Keith. Instead, I called a friend of mine, Alina, a forensic accountant who'd helped me out during a zoning audit a few years back. I emailed her the spreadsheet and asked her to look for anything that didn't match up. She called me the next morning. Danny, that rental company, she said. It's not real. The tax ID registered to it is inactive. The address is a P.O. box. The phone number redirects to a voicemail that hasn't been updated in over a year. I sat down slowly, gripping the edge of the kitchen counter. You're saying she created a fake company? Not just that. She billed nearly $30,000 to it. I cross-checked the payments. They all came through the HOA's operating account, which she had access to until you guys removed her. There's no sign any of the equipment ever existed. I exhaled through my teeth. We need to get this to the DA. She agreed to compile her findings into a formal report, which I delivered to the district attorney's office the following Monday. Sergeant Harwell was already familiar with the case and stepped in immediately to help open a second investigation. This time, the charges were bigger: wire fraud, embezzlement, and falsifying financial records. The evidence was airtight. Alina's report included screenshots of Marlene's authorizations, the phony vendor ledger, and time-stamped payment approvals from the HOA bank account. What sealed it was the email records. The board had preserved her old email archive, and I gained temporary access through a written request co-signed by Keith and the legal subcommittee. Inside the folder marked Vendor Correspondence, I found a draft message addressed to a fake name, Steve R., supposedly the rental vendor, but the email had never been sent. Instead, it was saved as a draft and written in the same tone Marlene used when she responded to residents. The kicker: the reply to address was her personal email with one letter changed. She had been replying to herself. The DA's office added 3 more felony charges. A grand jury was convened the following week, and within days, a formal indictment was announced. The news made the local paper, then the evening news. A reporter even knocked on Dad's door asking for a quote. He declined and pointed her down the street. The second arrest came fast. This time, Marlene didn't get to walk out of her house. Detectives executed a search warrant and seized 2 laptops, a tablet, and several HOA documents she hadn't returned. She didn't speak during the arrest, but the look on her face said everything: cornered, exposed, and utterly out of moves. The trial was set for the spring, but a plea deal was reached before then. She pled guilty to reduced charges in exchange for full restitution and a formal apology to the HOA and named victims. The court ordered her to pay back the $30,000 she stole and permanently barred her from holding any fiduciary role in a public or private organization. Part of the restitution included auctioning off personal assets: her SUV, designer handbags, and the patio furniture she'd once coded as a strategic board resource. The community center hosted the auction. Half the neighborhood showed up, more out of curiosity than greed. Someone bought her espresso machine for $20. My dad walked home with a ceramic planter shaped like a flamingo. He called it poetic justice. At the next board meeting, Keith stood up and held a short vote to officially close the books on the Marlene era. The motion passed unanimously. No applause, no celebration, just quiet relief. Afterward, I walked out to the parking lot with Tasha and Alina, who'd come to see the process through. "I never thought spreadsheets could bring someone down like that," Tasha said. Alina laughed. "People think crime always looks like ski masks and gunfire, but most of the time it's just someone with access and no conscience." Dad and I returned to our usual routine. On Saturdays, we tended to the flower beds and watched the neighborhood kids ride their bikes without getting scolded for chalk drawings or unauthorized play. The birdhouse now had a second story. The HOA approved it with a handwritten note from Keith and a little doodle of a bluebird. The community had changed, not through shouting or protests, but through facts, vigilance, and people finally refusing to be intimidated. The board now included 2 residents who'd never even attended meetings before all this began. People were engaged, opinionated, and most of all, unafraid. One afternoon, Dad and I sat on the porch as the sun dipped behind the rooflines. "You think it'll ever go back to the way it was?" he asked. I shook my head. "No, but that's a good thing." He leaned back in his chair, arms behind his head. "I liked the old HOA when they used to just hand out barbecue flyers and argue about holiday lights." I smiled. "We'll get back to that, just without the fake liens and embezzlement." He chuckled softly, then nodded toward the birdhouse. "Birds seem to like the new setup." "They've got good instincts," I said. That evening, Keith called to ask if I'd consider running for a board seat. I declined, but offered to help rewrite the bylaws to require independent audits and third-party oversight of all financial processes. He agreed, and we scheduled the first review session for the following week. The HOA wasn't perfect. It might never be, but it was finally honest, and that was more than enough. Marlene faded into memory, an example, a cautionary tale, but never again a threat. And every time a bird fluttered up to that little house on the porch, I remembered how a woman tried to find my dad over nothing, and how a community stood up and took everything back.